तो तुझे हमेशा से पता था कि मुझे पीएचडी करनी है या फिर it was after
Not
coming in?
really.
Okay.
Yeah.
What type of motivation is the right motivation for PhD?
If you're doing PhD for anything, which doesn't have to do with PhD, for example, like getting a better job or something, you're gonna be frustrated at some point.
तूने ये कैसे डिसाइड किया कि इंडिया से करनी है या यूएस से करनी है या यूरोप से करनी है?
I was interested in robotics, right? So that already trimmed down the top like 5 or 6 universities that I was really thinking about. They were mostly split up in US and UK.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Chapter 1 podcast. Today we have with us Priyam, जो कि मेरी बहुत ही अच्छी दोस्त है. For last 15 years, we did college together. Priyam actually is a PhD in Cognitive Robotics, and right now she is a research engineer at Meta in the Fair Lab, जो कि again बहुत fancy है and बहुत difficult है. Priyam is one of the most inspiring and also the most पढ़ी लिखी person that I know. So I'm very excited to call her on the pod today and also learn about her career journey क्योंकि personally मुझे वो बहुत ही inspiring लगती है क्योंकि जो इतना उसने पढ़ाई की है मैं तो कभी सोच भी नहीं सकती. So welcome Priyam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. You really built me up. Let's see where we go.
So let's start from the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background कि पढ़ाई कहाँ से की और कैसे सोचा कि okay engineering करते हैं.
Yeah. So it starts I'm from a small city in India, Jabalpur in Madhya Pradesh. So the starting of engineering was basically that everyone has 2 or 3 choices. कि doctor बनोगे, engineer बनोगे, X बनोगे. And my dad was an engineer, so I was very much enamored by वो जो करते थे. So I wanted to be an engineer. I got into IIIT Hyderabad, which is where we met.
Yeah.
I was doing electronics and communication while you were in computer science. And at that time, doing electronics and communication was a debated topic मेरे घर पे. Because
Oh.
computer science is supposed to be like the do all be all, right? But I feel like my journey from there onwards definitely has this flavor because I was in ECE and not CSE. So yeah, that's how I got until there. ECE was interesting because, as I said, computer science takes you into like high-paying jobs and packets. That wasn't the default path in ECE.
तो एक्चुअली होल्ड ऑन देयर तो तूने मतलब सोच के इसी लिया था कि
Yeah,
तुझे ओ माय गॉड दैट्स वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग अच्छा तो तुझे पता था क्योंकि आई थिंक मोस्ट ऑफ द पीपल आई नो या फिर इंक्लूडिंग भी कोई आइडिया ही नहीं है बस इंजीनियरिंग ले ली कि अच्छा रैंक ये होता है तो तुम्हें ये फील्ड मिलेगी बट यू एक्चुअली न्यू कि तुझे इसी करना है ओके
yeah. My choice was ECE over CSE in IIIT Hyderabad.
इंटरेस्टिंग
I also had a weird rebel streak. I was like, oh, अच्छा, सब लोग अगर CS ले रहे हैं, हमें ऊपर CS बोलते तो नहीं लेना. So that's part of it. It was my choice.
ओके
Now, yeah, necessity leads to creativity, as we say.
तो तुझे हमेशा से पता था कि मुझे पीएचडी करनी है या फिर इट वाज आफ्टर
Not
कमिंग इन
really.
ओके ओके
Yeah, yeah. Even like the masters, ECE, I started this honors course just because I wanted to do something interesting. And that was the way you could get into computer science and ECE intersection in these research labs. And from there onwards, there was a little bit of like, PhD, doing research is fun, but I don't know if I want to take a PhD, a big jump, because 6 or 7 years. I wasn't sure how finances work in higher studies, being in US, UK, India, wherever. And so I think masters was like this soft launch pad where I wanted to just go and try out and see what this feels like. If nothing else, I can always jump into a job life. But just like doing research projects, doing an internship where I was coding my own research project, all of that led me to a place where I was like, nahi yaar, I like creating these new research methodologies. And so that led to, probably I want to do PhD if I want to have that independence down the line in my job. And I was also naive. So I was just having fun doing research and it seemed like I could get the financial support. So it seemed like, why not?
Okay, so after you joined EC, you were like, "Acha, how do I become successful in this field?" So you
Yeah.
saw people around you जो भी successful है वो mostly higher studies के लिए जाते हैं कि undergrad is not enough for EC. तो you started exploring कि अच्छा masters कर सकते हैं या फिर PhD कर सकते हैं. And you
Yeah.
started doing some research projects and you started enjoying that, and that's how
Yeah.
you decided. Got it.
Exactly.
Okay. रिसर्च प्रोजेक्ट्स वगैरह तो किया, लेकिन उसके बाद फिर एक्चुअली डिड यू डू मास्टर्स या पहले जा सीधा ही तूने पीएचडी करी थी?
I did masters first, so I was in Carnegie Mellon Robotics Institute. I did a master's there, like with the research thesis. And after that, I applied for a few jobs, but I also applied for PhD at a bunch of universities. Then I got into Georgia Tech through the PhD application, and like that has been my PhD journey. Yeah.
गॉट इट। एक्चुअली जब तू पीएचडी का सोच रही थी तो उसमें तुझे पता था कि लाइक इन विच डोमेन यू वांटेड टू गो? हाउ डिड यू फिगर आउट पीएचडी के इस डोमेन में जाना है मुझे, बिकॉज इट्स रियली डिफिकल्ट टू नो बिफोर गेटिंग इनटू इट, राइट?
या एक तो वो वाली चीज है कि बीइंग फ्रॉम द इंडियन स्टडी सिस्टम, you get into undergrad and you're already committed to a particular stream. It's not like the American way of doing undergrad. So I think thoda sa wo leap of faith was inbuilt. But also PhD application, like by design, they want you to commit to something. They want to understand that you have a research statement. You have an understanding of what sort of research you want to do and why. So I think it's like partly understanding generally what scope excites you, but also studying the universities that you're applying to so that you can pose yourself as a candidate that they would be happy to work with. So, for example, I did my master's in human robot interaction. And from there on, that was like just a general scope of things. And it's just human robot interaction, right? Wherever humans and robots are interacting together in whatever way that falls under the scope. And there were obviously these professors, which were highly regarded in this field. So going through their research papers, seeing what sort of problems they're working on right now, and pitching myself as a student interested in that, and adding my experience so far to validate like why I would be a good fit in that particular research domain. So that's usually how the PhD application goes. You have to pitch yourself as a specific person in some ways, but also be like flexible enough. So if someone comes and says, "Oh, great, but we are actually not interested in this part, but that part," you could be like, "Oh no, yeah, generally interested in this area. Yes, good to go."
Okay, you basically got this exposure जब तूने masters की, and during your masters you were doing different projects, you got
Mm-hmm.
exposure to different profs and different universities, and फिर you
Yeah,
decided ये अच्छा this I find interesting and this is cool and this is
exactly.
what I want to do.
Yeah.
So how early did you decide, and like how did you start building your profile once you decided कि मुझे PhD करनी है?
That's a good question. So, starting just thoda sa pehle with masters, even for masters, I think it was the last 1 or 1.5 years of undergrad where I had this clarity that this is something I'm gonna try for. So, doing the honors program where we would have a mentor professor who would give us a research project. We would do a research project together, build up that experience. And obviously, you do all of this so that you can get good recommendation letters. You have done some cool projects that you could write about and talk why you are a good research candidate and all of this. I think that started 1.5 years before. And genuinely last, it was the December and like the 5 months before the application, because they're all usually due on December. All of that went in finishing up your projects in undergrad, writing up research statements, getting recommendation letter, writing the GRE exam, all of this, applying. So that's like the application thing. So it happened 1.5 years before like graduating. And I think six or 12 months was actual research, and 6 months was basically doing all of this, wrapping up and putting everything together with a bow on top. So that was that. For PhD, I started my master's in fall of 2013. So that means September 2013, I started. And the summer of the next year, I went for an internship. So I had given myself this period कि इस पूरे में I will do research, then I will go through this internship experience and actually understand कि whether I like being in A, like the A environment or the B environment more. And I think this time, and I was keeping my options open. I had not like ruled out कि I'm not gonna do an internship because PhD करनी या फिर I won't do any research क्योंकि मुझे कॉप में ही जाना है. So obviously it entailed doing a lot more, but it was good because when I realized by the end of my internship कि I want to do PhD, I already had a research project for the last 1 year, which was in like a full motion. I had already done these research heavy courses, which gave me credits as well as understanding of what fundamental research is about, what are the questions in robotics, and all of these things. And then again, it was a 3 semester master's. So 12 months I put together to actually do the meat of the research, do the meat of the work. And then जो आखिरी के 6 महीने थे, that was again doing all of these applications, getting writing research statements, getting recommendation letter, and like wrapping up my masters in general, which was submitting a paper, doing all of the end stuff. So that's how it went. That was how it was for me. But I have seen other people being a lot more intentional in their decisions on how to do this. For example, so I started my PhD in Georgia Tech, but then I moved to UC San Diego because my advisor decided to switch universities. And we had a really good equation, so I went with him. And I have seen these really driven undergrads who, in like their third year, have already decided that research is amazing. And they're basically publishing papers like third year PhD from like 7 years ago. So the speed of PhD, or rather the requirements for PhD, have gone up a lot, as in the number of papers people expect, the number of citations people expect. And you can also see this becoming like more of an intentional effort rather than being naive like me that, oh, this is research, it sounds interesting, so I'm going to go do it. So there's like different ways of going about this. I think mine was average in between, where it wasn't a last minute decision ki, oh, let's just try and dekhte kya hota hai. I did some amount of preparation, but then I've also seen like the other extreme where people, just how we prepare for IIT JEE, it's like it starts from ninth or 10th. And
Yeah.
similarly, you have cases like that here in undergrad as well.
So where people have like extreme clarity or extreme pressure from
Exactly.
parents ki PhD to karni hai.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And also
actually,
exposure, just to
yeah,
add on to that, it's like
yeah,
exposure as well. I don't think
yeah.
the kind of research you get to do in US universities is actually quite exciting, and already you have more resources than at least we used to get in our time in Indian undergrad studies. So there's also that exposure part to it too.
One question there. तूने एक चीज बोली कि you were confused even in masters during your masters कि PhD करूँ या नहीं करूँ because obviously it's a
Yeah.
very big commitment. So you did internship and then
Mm-hmm.
you decided कि मुझे करनी है research. तो I keep hearing this thing कि research job different होता है. तो I know these terms, but on day to day में like how is
Mm-hmm.
it different? रिसर्च लाइफ कैसी होती है और जैसे तूने इंटर्नशिप की वो लाइफ कैसी थी और क्या डिफरेंस थे जिससे तूने डिसाइड किया कि अच्छा नहीं दिस इज व्हाट आई लाइक गोइंग अ लिटिल बिट डीपर देयर.
So I think it might sound superficial, but I think the difference comes down to having the freedom to not do the things you don't want to do. So in
Correct.
research, when you're like in the academic setup, you can propose your own research problem, your own research plan, and follow through on it. And there is some amount of this is my work. Iska bottom line goes to my reputation, my character as a researcher. And so a lot of things come in your way, you implement them, you get it done, and there's this internal motivation towards it. On the other hand, in my internship, it was great because 80% of it was implementing what I had already done in my research project as like the C plus library for the company that I was doing internship for. But then the last 20% was wrapping it up and making sure it fits a certain way into their constraints, etc., etc. And I realized that's the part which really takes my energy too much. Uh, and it lacks that internal motivation, right? That this is going to my bottom line. No, it's going to the company's bottom line. It would be great if the two match, but yeah. So I think that was the in 2014 for a young Priam, that was a big deal, and it seemed like the kind of freedom I would want to have in the next 5 or 6 years, where I learn this field that I had gotten really interested in. So yeah, I would say that's the big difference.
दैट मेक्स सेंस. दैट्स वेरी इंसाइटफुल फॉर मी एज वेल क्योंकि मैंने कभी आई थिंक इसे पूछा नहीं. रिसर्च सब कहते हैं कि इट्स फन बट ऐसा क्या डिफरेंस होता है. दैट मेक्स अ लॉट ऑफ सेंस. Going a little bit more into the process of applying for PhD, तो तूने ये कैसे डिसाइड किया कि इंडिया से करनी है या यूएस से करनी है या यूरोप से करनी है, बोथ मास्टर्स एंड
Mm-hmm.
पीएचडी एक्चुअली. क्योंकि यूरोपियन यूनिवर्सिटीज भी है काफ़ी, इंडिया में भी है,
Yeah.
यूएस भी पॉपुलर है. हाउ डिड यू थिंक अबाउट इट? एंड पीपल, I'm mainly asking it for people who are thinking about doing PhDs, and what framework would you give them?
Yeah, yeah. So I was interested in robotics, right? So that already trimmed down the top like 5 or 6 universities that I was really thinking about. They were mostly split up in US and UK. Then the second layer of this was actually seeing the people around me and seeing what sort of universities they were going into. And it's two things, right? You can get mentoring into what sort of applications make sense. Plus, you also have some validation that these universities think that people from our college are actually like good candidates. And
Oh,
so that was the
interesting.
second layer. Yeah.
Okay, तो
Because
उसके अंदर फिर your chances of getting into increases is what you're saying. Okay.
because you are going to get your number one PhD applications. My recommendation letters are really important, right? And those usually come from your advisor, the person that you've done a research project with. And by having someone who was in the same research lab as you being accepted in a university basically means the recommendation letter that जो इस research lab का head लिख रहा है holds value in the admission process for this university. And definitely, this is not a logistic that should be ignored. I will go later maybe into the caveats and the exceptions that I've seen, but this is the framework that I was working with. So, based on all of this, I ended up applying to, I think, like a total of 10 ish universities for my master's. CMU Robotics Institute was always my top university because just people from EC had gone there. One of our batchmates, Krishna, he had gone there for a summer scholars program and he had quite hyped it up for me. So I really, that was one of my top universities. And then UK, I applied a little bit less, probably one or two universities, because there just weren't enough people for me to look and say कि अच्छा इन्होंने वहाँ पे यूनिवर्सिटी में अप्लाई किया, they got accepted, and this was their experience.
Got
I
it.
think, yeah, this also speaks a little bit with my circle of influence. I know, like, especially the guys in our batch who knew these other seniors who, who weren't that popular a face, but they had gone to UK and so they had some information about how UK universities work. I just did not have that in my circle of influence. So it's conditioned on that. So that's how I decided this US thing. And once you come here, you do master's in the US, it was in CMU. You start, obviously, the US professors hype up US colleges more. And you also, the kind of papers that that I was referred in order to read for my research projects were more from the US universities rather than the UK universities. And so that also then starts conditioning you a little bit. So that's why I applied to more, again, even more universities in the US and Canada for my PhD. So I got conditioned more towards US and India, and that completely became the US and Canada while I was in US. So that's how that went. The reason why I never thought about an Indian university was two things. We had an MTech program in our college. I never really heard anyone go gaga about it as compared to these people who were already doing masters somewhere else and being quite happy with it. And I also wanted to see how exposure feels like, how technology feels once you go to these well-regarded universities. And something that you have usually कई बार उसकी value कम हो जाती है, right? So it was like, okay, for the next step, I gotta jump higher. It was like that. Um,
Yeah.
and
Also, I think resources to ज़्यादा है ही. I mean, you cannot deny that,
exactly,
right? Like, even
exactly,
if
exactly.
talent बहुत हो India में, but you cannot beat America in resources कि तुम्हें सब कुछ मिलेगा, अच्छी conditions मिलेगी, सब funding वगैरह मिल जाएगी. So that makes your life easier, and there are a lot of other
Yeah,
people
yeah.
also there जो similar चीज़ें कर रहे हैं. तो yeah, makes sense.
In fact, thanks for bringing this up. I This reminded me of a very specific instance that happened, which also conditioned my thinking towards this. In our robotics research lab, we had this drone, which was like it was not an India-made drone. It was like an overseas hardware. And at some point, either uski rotators or uska battery, one of those things, got busted. And that was only available in US, and they weren't selling it to an Indian university
Oh my God.
because it's drone and batteries being protected materials, all that. And so I remember our research lab reaching out to, I think, UPenn key robotics lab to get this particular hardware. And they basically denied it because they don't have a relationship together. They weren't in a project together. Yeah. And that was just something which lingered in my brain rent free, where it was like, oh, okay, we are actually limited in resources and the things that we can do just by the virtue of where we are and what sort of materials we have access to.
Okay. So let's talk about the financial aspect of doing a PhD, especially I think US or Europe में मतलब outside India. कि I know कि you get a stipend if you're doing PhD, but I don't know the details. कि is that enough for a life in US? So talk a little bit about that. अगर कोई सोच
So I'm going to first talk about US specific things, and then I'll open it up to USA versus UK based on my understanding and like the conversations I've had with my advisor, who's actually like a German or a Dutch professor. So starting from US, you do get funding, and usually if you're in a low cost of living locale, the stipend is more than enough. But there are a few other, you also have to live your lifestyle within that stipend limits, but as long as you're able to do that,
business
it's
class
sufficient.
flight नहीं ले सकते क्या उसके
Oh,
अंदर
exactly. And like buying, I don't know, Gucci or something.
Yeah, Gucci bags. Okay, that's
Just
okay.
need to give up small things.
Okay, okay. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So that's one thing. And the other thing is still you need to look at the fee structure of a particular university. So I have had my experience in CMU, which is located in Pittsburgh, which is a pretty low cost of living city, and still the university is great. The second sample point was Georgia Tech, which is in Atlanta, which is a much bigger city. And they also had a different fee structure. So we'll talk about that. And then the third university that I had experiences in is University UC San Diego, which is again pretty high cost of living. It's San Diego, a pretty big city. But again, they had a different fee structure than the previous universities. So let's talk about CMU in Pittsburgh first. The good thing here, so I started my master's here. You don't get a full ride when you start your master's. So I basically paid for my own lodging, my own tuition fee, and everything for the first semester I was here. And this is where, sorry, give me one second. My call aa raha tha. Okay, going back. So when you start masters, you don't actually get a full ride. You need to, so basically what I did was I paid for my own tuition, my own lodging and everything for the first semester. And this is some place that your field of research also becomes important. The thing with CMU RI was I knew before coming that robotics has a lot of funding. They have a lot of tie-ups with either companies or defense, which means an influx of funding for students who can do some research for them. So I knew this before coming in. On the other hand, if you're going for some other field of research, it may mean a different outcome. You might not have as much a percentage of funding coming in per batch of researchers. जैसे कि I knew in robotics, if there's a cohort of 15 people, I knew this about like CMURI, I had done some pre-research. If there's a cohort of 15 people, usually 13 of those end up getting funding to do research.
Okay, that's
So it was pretty high.
it was quite good. But तुझे दूसरी
Exactly.
पता है जैसे non-robotics where people were struggling to get funding for their research?
Yeah, I'll go to Georgia Tech after this and talk a little bit
Okay.
about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, CMU-RI was like this, and Pittsburgh was pretty cheap to live in. So to talk like specific numbers, I used to get 2,200 or 2,250 per month as my stipend. My rent, utility, everything together was like 550 or 600. So I was like saving a decent chunk of money, which meant I didn't have to worry about my health. I could visit my parents. I even was able to get gifts for my parents, which was crazy. Uh, Once I went to Georgia Tech, the stipend more or less remained the same. I think it went down a little bit because Georgia Tech had a structure where if you are an incoming PhD student, you get about, I think, 1,800 or 2,000 until you finish your, they're called qualifier exams. We can talk about what qualifier exams are later, but they basically, there's in Georgia Tech, there was three levels to graduating towards a PhD. It was qualifier exams, proposal, and defense. So once you do the qualifier exams, your stipend increases by a particular percentage. And already Atlanta was higher cost of living. So that meant making a lot of adjustments to go from the setup A to setup B. Another thing was they had an international student fee, which
Oh,
CMU did not have exactly. So I needed to pay, I think, like $2,000 every semester when it started. So there was obviously this additional thing of you need to save up for this, or you need to have some way of figuring out this money. So that was Georgia Tech, and it was higher cost of living as well. So it added to my stresses, basically. Then coming to UC San Diego, it was weirdly better than Atlanta because the stipend again went up. It was, I think, like 2,300 or something. It was still high cost of living, but there was no international student fee. And while I was, full disclosure, while I was living in like San Diego, I was with my significant other. So like the financial stressors were not a lot. So take
but
that
if
part
you're
with a grain
living
of salt.
alone, but if you were living alone, I think rent vagera in San Diego is a bit higher. It's in
It is,
California.
yeah. So what
Yeah,
you so now talking about the rent, usually in Pittsburgh, you can expect it to go like this.
yeah,
In Pittsburgh, you can expect a full room to yourself,
yeah.
and maybe if you really want to save, you can rent out like a living room and stuff, and 500, 600, you're done. In Atlanta, you would imagine like more than the number of bedrooms people living in there. That was just the general setup. Although I was in a place where I was spoiled by being in Pittsburgh, so I paid a little bit more than the baseline to have my own room. But in UC San Diego, it was standard that every bedroom would have two people sharing it. So, like, you can see this
Yeah,
variation is the standard way of living for a like graduate student as you go through like these different setups of universities and cities.
got it.
Um, we were talking about funding though. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. If you have any questions on this, good. Otherwise, I'll go to the
No, I
next
think
one.
so. Basically, just to summarize, it's like कि ठीक है, in most cities in US, you would be able to survive on that stipend. ऐसा कोई luxurious life नहीं जी सकोगे. In some cities, maybe a little comfortable. In some cities,
Yeah.
maybe a bit uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm,
especially
mm-hmm.
if you get a bad roommate. But in general, like you can, ऐसा नहीं है कि you'll have to take a loan या फिर घर से पैसे मंगाने
Yeah,
पड़ेंगे. You'll be able to manage it.
it's
Yeah.
a distribution. Yeah. Now the second point is this is when you get funding and how it works across like the different regions of US and different universities. Now the other thing is how do you get this funding? Where does this come from? As I said for my masters, it was great because it was just for a year. And usually these funding projects they last for usually like 12 months to 16 months. That's the usual that goes. So it worked well for that like small patch of time. But once you come to a PhD is not a 12-month thing. You are doing this for 5 years or 6 years, which basically means you need to have some source of funding lined up before your last source of funding dries up.
Yeah.
And this is where advisors and your general program really helps. So CMU, Georgia Tech, and UC San Diego, I think all three of these promised their PhD students that they would have, I think, 1 or 2 years. I'm not sure which one had one, which one had two, but at least for the first year, all of these universities had their like funding sorted. The university would fund them as they figure out which advisor they work the best with, what sort of projects fit their interest the best, and like vice versa.
Oh, interesting. So this also depends on the university. That some
Mm-hmm.
universities have this option or this program कि first year we will fund you. You figure out your advisor, you figure out कि कहाँ से funding आएगी आगे की.
Yes.
But not
Yes.
every university provides that.
Exactly. And
Oh,
so this is
interesting.
where like you get into the field of research and field of, I guess, your major. So this is true for robotics and all three of these places. And that's because robotics right now is
Pretty
not
cool.
even just right now. Yeah, even back then it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And for computers to be fair and MLE to
अब
be
अब
very
तो
fair.
it's all AI, right?
Yeah,
Robotics
yeah,
is
now and everything is AI.
तो अब तो पैसा ही
Robotics
पैसा
is
है.
just an application of AI. Didn't you hear?
Yeah. So this is
Yeah,
a
that's
very
where you're
important kind of point. If you're choosing a
exactly.
college and you should choose the right college, which gives you that flexibility
Exactly. Do your research. This is
for
like
the
you get
research.
funding. Exactly. Research for the research.
Okay,
PhD is funded, is the baseline, but then you have exceptions above and below this. Uh,
got it.
yeah. And now moving on, again, as I said, you have to have your next source of funding already queued in before your last one runs out, which means you are in an elevator pitch mode almost like every 1.5 years while you're in your PhD. American students in US usually have an edge because they can apply for National Science Foundation funding and other such government given funding, which is very flexible. Usually international students end up going for slightly more constrained sources of funding, which come from like corporations which need a particular research project or some other company which has some research tie up with one of the advisors. And this is where I feel like when we're initially talking about why I did research and what is the difference, I talked about me being naive and having understanding that there's this freedom, right? This whole notion got shattered once I realized how funding works in PhD. So sure, it's still funding like your dream of what research should be, but you have to do it in service of some sort of external goal.
Yeah.
So interesting. It's interesting.
So, यहाँ पे भी being an international student, we have to live with constraints. So even if
Yes,
you
yes.
choose, okay, got it, got it.
Yeah.
So, like,
Oh, so one last point. I was talking about USA versus UK. So this is what I just talked about, very USA specific. UK actually has usually 3 or 4 year projects for PhD programs already funded. So once you go there, you actually get like a much longer uh, like platform for actually doing your research and not being in this elevator pitch mode. But that means again, like your contract is very much tied to the deliverables which have already been decided. So just FYI for people trying to figure out the differences between these.
sorry, I didn't get it. So basically, UK में, yeah, in general, Europe में, I'm guessing, you get funding for a longer duration, but still
Mhm.
there is less flexibility. You
Exactly,
can,
exactly. Because you can think here every 1.5 year, you can go pitch to 5 different people
yeah,
and find the one collaborator who seems most synergistic with what you want to do. That means you get to like elevator pitch more often, but more flexible. In the Europe system of doing PhD, you get funding for a much longer horizon, but these deliverables have already been decided. You might have some leeway in like changing these as you go through it, but it's not like finding someone completely new and synergistic to work with if the first setup doesn't make sense.
got it, got it. Okay. PhD करने के बाद like what are the different options? I know कि कुछ लोग professor बन जाते हैं and you came back to the industry. Just talk us a little bit about after doing the PhD, like what are the different career options one can pursue?
Great question. So of course, there's the professor route where you go become a professor, you do research, you're on a tenure track, you're trying to publish as much as you can, right? The other one in corporate life is the default one is usually you get a job which like really matches your research interests, and then you basically help the company implement something related to that research. The other slightly better, and this is where again, like even research jobs have their freedom hierarchy. Freedom is just such a valuable notion to researchers, sorry. But yeah, in this hierarchy,
Huh.
the other one is you actually get to start an open ended research lab funded by one of these companies, which is basically like having an academic research lab, but just not funded by NSF or something. It's being funded by this company. And what's the year right now? 2024. So until early 2022, I would say FAIR, DeepMind, Microsoft Research, all of these places existed in just like this dreamland where they were doing open-ended research, they were being funded by these companies, they did not have to do elevator pitch. It was great. Right?
Yeah.
You just go and have like dreams and think about things and implement them.
Yeah.
So that those are the three things. Now, some non-popular but still viable things that I've seen are some many people go on to have their own startups. A lot, yeah, a lot
Yeah.
of these from especially from robotics tend to be implementation heavy, where they have this idea of what this robot can do. They have understood a lot about why robots do not work in the wild, and so like they just have a better platform to start with. Recently, ever since machine learning became a big thing in robotics, you also see students who have had like these pivotal machine learning robotics paper actually make a startup out of that in a pretty constrained scope, sure, But it's great to see actual research being applied rather than like the learnings from why something works slash doesn't work. Another way of getting like what to do after PhD is actually going into a consulting position. And this is
Oh.
where, yeah, you can operate as a freelancer. You have freedom of who do you talk to, what do you talk to them about. And this is, I've seen less people do this and mostly not international students because we have with H1B and everything that you need to be employed for these many hours in this particular way, etc., etc. But this also happens.
Okay, so basically, you have domain expertise, you're very
Hmm.
deep in a subject. So either you can be a consultant, or because you're so deep in a subject, तुम अपना कुछ start कर लेते हो, जिसके
Hmm.
actually बहुत सारे examples हैं. सजल की
Yeah, yeah.
कंपनी भी Databricks भी वैसे ही start हुई है ना, PhD उनका जो project
Oh,
है उसके बाद.
cool. I didn't know
Yeah,
that's
it
cool.
was okay, great. Now let's come to little existential question. तो I genuinely respect people who do PhD क्योंकि मैंने शुरू में भी बोला कि I can't even imagine doing that. And it's a very difficult life.
Yeah.
में बहुत कम मिलते हैं. So you have to be really passionate about it. Now, having been through this, what would you advise people who are thinking about PhD or especially बताने के लिए कि PhD is definitely not for you if you are thinking about it like this क्योंकि
Hmm.
एक notion होता है ना कि हाँ it'll be all hunky dory freedom तो like what type of motivation is the right motivation for PhD.
Yeah. So I think there's two things: motivation and discipline, and just so one is the goal, the other is the process, right? So I think goal wise, if you're doing PhD for anything which doesn't have to do with PhD, for example, like getting a better job or something, you're going to be frustrated at some point because the rewards are super delayed. There's no gratification during the 6 years, which tells you how close you've gotten to this final goal. This has slightly changed, especially with like machine learning and AI PhDs, because you can get into Google, you can get into Fair, you can get into all of these internships, which helps you prep your job profile. But generally, for PhD, irrespective of the research field, if that's your goal, you're going to have a tough time. And in terms of process, if you are willing to treat your PhD as a job, you'll be fine. You need to show up for it as if it's a job, get started at 9 or 10, finish at 5 or 6, go live your life. That's how you do a marathon, right? This is not a 1 year thing. This is not a 2 year thing. This is at least a 4 year thing, even if you're like super dedicated and driven. And unlike undergrad, you will be chipping away at the same problem. You won't have the excitement of starting a new semester and having an entirely new set of courses to look at. It's the same old problem that you've been thinking about for any years now. So you need to have that discipline. So I would say those two, I'm simplifying it a lot, obviously, but I think those two would be my like top questions to ask yourself.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's very insightful and it'll be very useful for people making that decision. Thank you.